Hey, everybody, this is Nevin Gusak, the host for the Patriotic Populist, and today we have a very special guest that we're going to be having for several episodes of this show because he is a wealth of knowledge. I've mentioned him both as a highly credible source, some criticisms as well on the show, and we wanted to get Jeffrey Nyquist here to discuss his vast knowledge on national security issues, especially related to Russia and China. His writings and research, including one of his first book, Origins of the Fourth World War, has profoundly impacted my thinking on a variety of issues. And we wanted to hear from the man himself. He is an author, he is a longtime national security analyst. Um, and he has a lot of very interesting experiences, run-ins with the left. He has interviewed a wide variety of defectors from Russia and Latin American communist countries and China and elsewhere with some very frightening testimony. And we wanted to do a little bit of, I guess, an intelligence debriefings here, multi-part with Jeff Nyquist. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Nevin. Thank you for having me. Nice introduction.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. So I'm going to have my handy dandy 32 ounces bottles of water. It's one of my drinks of choice. So I'm going to be chugging this along while we do this interview. But for
hmm
once, I'm not going to do nearly as much talking. So you're going to be in the hot seat tonight.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I apologize to those who are seeing the image here. I've got the sun coming through a window here, and if I pull too close to the camera, it looks weird, and I'm just going with the sun. It feels good anyway to have after a winter here, to have a warm sunshine hitting me from behind.
Yeah, sounds good to me. Springtime is here, especially in the Midwest portion of the
Upper
United
Midwest, yeah,
States.
we're really far north here. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. Well, sounds good. It's been beautiful weather down here. Had a great day at the beach. Yesterday, spent time with my daughter. Saturday, couldn't have asked for better weather. Sunny, low 80s, very typical, atypical for a Florida spring where it's usually a lot hotter. So,
hmm
very thankful for the great weather, great times, great weekend. And now we're going to talk some Turkey. We're going to talk national security. Jeff, why don't you go over your list of writings, publications, your books, if you could list them, please.
Well, I wrote The Origins of the Fourth World War. Came out about 1988. Before that, I'd written some articles for Conservative Review and actually, that another magazine. It's not coming to me right now. So I had done some magazine articles. I had been an academic, and I left graduate school because communism, Marxists were very active, and really I couldn't get around them. I had to tell the truth about what I thought, and that got me into trouble. So you couldn't be forthrightly opposed to Marxism and really have any kind of chance. You were having a miserable time. They would block you in different ways, prevent you from getting work, um, make it really hard for you. And I don't know that there's a whole lot. If you're really an anti-communist, a serious one, uh, no kind of credential is going to be easy, and you're not going to be able to do much with it once you get it. That was my experience, and so I just went off in my own direction. I wrote the book. I owned a business in the 90s, and then the book got attention, and I worked for Newsmax. I worked for WorldNet Daily. I wrote for Sierra Times. And then for 12 years I wrote for Financial Sense,
Mhm.
and then freelancing, writing for my blog now, blog, and I published books along the way. My second book was in Polish, Kon Trajanski. Uh, did not ever get published in English. Um, I My most recent book is The Fool and His Enemy. It's this one here. This came out last July. If people can see it there, can get that on Amazon. I wrote uh, Back from the Dead: Return of the Evil Empire with Cliff Kincaid and former KGB officer Konstantin Preobrazhensky. And there were a couple other authors. I think there were three or four of us on that book.
Mhm.
And then I wrote a book with Cliff called Red Jihad. and I covered a lot of the problems where Russia was getting the advantage on us. Uh, and I wrote a book with one other guy called The New Tactics of Global War. I think we wrote that in 2014 or 15. So, and I got a big archive at WorldNet Daily, Financial Sense. That's one of my biggest archives. So there's probably, I don't know, 1,200 to 1,400 articles online that I've written.
So you're quite the prolific writer and author, and your articles specifically in Newsmax and WorldNet Daily really confirm that Anatoly Golitsyn, who was a KGB major who defected to the United States through the American Embassy, I believe in Finland in 1961, and really and truly, your articles in Newsmax and WorldNet Daily really proved in my mind that Golitsyn was more right than was wrong. But let's backtrack a little bit. It's very interesting because I could relate a little bit to what you're saying. What really made you an anti-communist? What was unappealing about Marxism itself? What rubbed you the wrong way about Marxism that made you an anti-communist?
Well, I mean, I knew radicals when I was an undergraduate in college. I used to play chess and go with graduate students in the psychology department, and a couple of them, they were pro-communist, pro-socialist radicals. And I just didn't buy any of their ideas. They had some ridiculous ideas, and to me it seemed like what they were saying wasn't even common sense. So from a common sense point of view, socialism never really made much sense to me. But you wouldn't say that back in the late 70s or early 80s I was a strident anti-communist at all. I thought, well, I voted for Ronald Reagan. You know, you could probably describe me as conservative then. um, but when I started to get a teaching credential after I got my degree, my bachelor's degree in '81, and it was '83. I was working for AT&T back then, and I went back to school while I was working to get a teaching credential, and my master teacher was a communist. I didn't
Mm.
realize it at the time, but she liked me. She took a liking to me, and she invited me to a meeting at the Science Lecture Hall. This was on the UC Irvine campus.
Mhm.
And I went there, and it was all this communist literature on the tables out front of the Science Lecture Hall in the lobby. And I went in there, and I immediately this guy, he had like a Karl Marx beard. He was sort of the swarthy, complected guy. And he was a visiting professor. I don't remember his name now, but he was really a strident communist. Use that word again. And I thought to myself, I felt revulsion, and I thought, oh, no, be open-minded. Listen to what he has to say, because I'm a real believer in, because you don't learn anything if you close your mind and you say something's wrong automatically. You have to, and no matter how awful something is, you have to try it on, right? Which means
Mhm.
you have to not shoot it down before you've even heard it. So I sat there and I focused on being open-minded, and his speech was about overthrowing the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie in America. And the first thought I had, well, my dad, who had a television company who produced television shows and commercials, would be one of the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie guys, right? Because the bourgeoisie are the ruling, and he's bourgeois. Every business owner is a bourgeois. And
Mhm.
I thought, well, that's kind of odd. I'd be against my own class, right? Because I think, well, I'm not. I do. At the time, I worked for AT&T. I was a worker. I belonged to a union, so you could say I was part of the proletariat, right? Communication Workers of America, CWA. So I thought, well, yeah, maybe I'm a proletarian. Anyway, he went on about how they were infiltrating the Democratic Party to take it over through its left wing, and that there was going to be a depression in America eventually. There was going to be an economic crash, and then everybody was going to learn that capitalism was really not helping anybody, and then they could turn the whole system over to socialism. And I remember there was a guy there who said, "Well, what does that mean exactly? Turning, the system over to socialism. He says, well, we do what Lenin said. We nationalize all businesses and we run everything like the post office. And the guy angrily stood up and left. He says, if everything's run like the post office, that doesn't work. They can't deliver letters right. And he left angrily. And I thought, ooh, that was interesting. So I heard the rest of the speech, and of course, my master teacher was there in like the second row, oohing and awing, and they were all very impressed with this guy. But I wanted, at the end of that speech, to jump up and be the first person to shake his hand and congratulate him, because I wanted to feel what, you can get a feeling from somebody.
Mm-hmm.
So I jumped up and I smiled and I went up to him and I said, fantastic speech, and I shook his hand,
Mm-hmm.
and he just he was just overwhelmed. You could see he was very, very pleased to have somebody jump up and congratulate him. And of course I did that to get a reading on him, but my teacher had seen it and maybe they read me the wrong way, because then there was a prolonged attempt to romance me as I left the program, came back a couple of years later, finished it because my work schedule was too difficult, finished the program, and then got invited by the dean of the School of Social Sciences to be in the graduate program. And so I ended up in graduate school in what they called the Politics and Society group at UC Irvine. It's political science, basically, political science sociology. And they were really kind of tracking me. And at one point, I got invited out to dinner and told they need a commitment from you. And so I wanted to pretend I didn't know what they were talking about, but I thought, no, that wouldn't be honest. I know who they are, but I was kind of shocked because I didn't know how that worked. And I realized I'd hung out with these people enough to know they were part of a cell. They were part of a communist apparatus on
Were
the
they
campus.
part of, I don't mean to interrupt, were they part of the CPUSA or the DSOC, which is the precursor of the DSA, or
They
did you?
didn't pull out any party cards. It wasn't like that. They weren't operating with badges and name cards and ID cards, but they were communists. They were communists.
They
They were
usually don't.
as red as a fire truck, and they were in the university. And by the way, in the 1980s, in order to teach at the University of California, you had to take an oath of allegiance, and these oaths were created during the McCarthy period in the 50s. And that applied to the University of California. And that oath of allegiance was to the Constitution of the United States and to the Constitution of California. You took one to each. Against all enemies, foreign and domestic, which, by the way, would include communism.
Yeah, what a
So
joke.
these people committed a crime when they swore that oath. So they weren't about to say, "Oh, look, I'm a communist." It didn't. People don't realize. Reagan was president. We were fighting the Cold War. You still couldn't just come out and say the kind of things that we are hearing now. They were hiding their light under a bushel to some extent. I mean, yeah, they had this meeting at the science lecture hall. Nobody noticed. There was just students and a handful of teachers there. I mean, it wasn't like there was no FBI investigating. There was nobody watching these people. But maybe if they had started being more overt, maybe somebody would have started investigating them. I don't know. I mean, this
Well,
is 86, I mean, it was from 83 to 87,
well,
88.
yeah, a little historical background. I mean, and I know you're familiar with this, but the audience might not be. I mean, during the 1980s, and this was reported by conservative newspaper columnists like Georgie N. Geyer and Tony Horrigan, who was one of the few conservative commentators, modern conservative commentators that I enjoyed reading because he was an independent thinker. And they all documented how there were literally thousands of Marxist-oriented professors on the campuses during the 1980s, despite the Reagan Revolution. In fact, one of the top Marxist professors out there at the time, Bertolt Ullman, actually bragged how Marxism was grabbing hold on the campuses in the United States. And of course, now this is my position and the position of the show. During the 1980s, you had the deconstruction of the American capitalist system that was stakeholder capitalism, that years of protectionism and legitimate regulations and controls on financial speculation balanced things out. and that was being deconstructed. And slowly but surely, you had extremist groups that were becoming popular and saying, well, look at these capitalist bastards and people on Wall Street. They're deconstructing the American dream. Join us. And when you read some of the communist newspapers today, that's a common recruiting tactic. I know a communist myself who has personally recruited people based on that formula. So you had that going on under Reagan. You had the Congress being the left wing of the Democratic Party was a real force then, and it still exists today. You had people like, look him up, George Crockett of Michigan, who was a congressman, Ronald Dellums, who basically the guy was a communist. I write about him extensively.
Right. Oh, yeah.
I mean,
oh,
the
yeah,
guy, I mean, he was awful. Bella Abzug.
Oh, yeah, and she definitely was a communist, yeah.
I mean, so this is not a paranoid fantasy of Jeff
No.
Nyquist or Trevor Loudon or Cliff Kincaid or even me. This is based on what they say.
Yeah, well, I think if I had not,
so Marxism
been liked,
was
if I had been liked and if I hadn't jumped up and enthusiastically shook the guy's hand and told him what great speech it was, everybody in the room saw me do that. But stupid me, I didn't think about how that looked to anybody else. I was interested in, when you shake somebody's hand and you compliment them, you get something out of that. You get the feeling of what and I got the feeling that he was in it for power and ego aggrandizement. That he was not, and that I also got the feeling that he was kind of an insecure, weak person. That was the other feeling I got, because he bloated up a little bit too much. Like if somebody compliments me too much, I'm kind of thinking like I want to grab my wallet. It's like, you're saying great stuff about me. Like, where I grew up, if you brag on yourself or somebody else brags on you, you're kind of embarrassed.
Yeah.
Because it's like, I'm so great, right? It's not, So, but anyway, I got a kind of measure of him, and I'd seen him on campus before. In fact, a guy I played Go with, a friend of mine who had his office in the Social Science Towers, this guy used to hang out in the office across the hall. This is in the 7th floor of the Social Science Tower back, oh my gosh, in the early 80s sometime. And this professor would be talking loudly. We could hear across the door, and I'm trying to, Go is a strategy game. I was crazy for chess and Go when I was a senior in college. And I would hear him talking about, when is the revolution going to be? When are we going to, all this strident Marxist stuff? And it was that same guy that gave the speech. That was the only time I had really seen him before. And I kind of remembered, because it was kind of odd. I kind of tucked my head. I kind of looked to see who was in that office. While the other guy was taking his turn. So you live in a place. You go to a school on a campus, and you have these experiences. But for me, I wouldn't have known these people were organized that much. I wouldn't have known the power they had. I wouldn't have known how they recruited, except they tried to recruit me. And I wouldn't have known the consequences to a person's career, except I had those consequences. And suddenly I had a different kind of responsibility knowing this than if I didn't know anything. Because suddenly my illusion that we were living in Reagan's America and communism was dying or dead and that there wasn't any concern was, there's something going on here, and it's not morning in America. Maybe it's dusk, and they've just confused the setting sun with the rising sun. Yeah.
Yeah, we on this show we take kind of a my co-host and I were former Republicans. I was, as you know, very active. I supported candidates before who were Republicans, and for many, many different reasons, I became disillusioned with Reaganism without fully descending into Marxism or National Socialism. Position of this show is we're against the solutions offered by Marxism and National Socialism. Similar to you in a way, I wanted to pursue an academic career myself as a history professor of political science, but there were two things that deterred for me. I knew very quickly that the social sciences were dominated by individuals who are very much the anti-Cold War left, and my politics at the time were staunchly anti-communist. They still are. I really felt I had no future, and frankly, I didn't want to take out more in the way of college loans and burden myself. I didn't think it was worth it for a career that was not guaranteed. So I shifted into secondary education and then ultimately went into library science. And I'd rather be my own boss with my own political show, my own author with full editorial control, along with my co-host, who more or less we think in a similar fashion. But one thing that was very revealing that I wanted to bring up again on the show, and those of you in the audience who remember my segment on why I'm not a Marxist or a socialist, that matter, I used to think back in the day that Leninism and Stalinism was a departure from Marxism, that Marx really didn't intend on a dictatorship. You know, we took his word for it for the withering away of the state, as he put it. But when you take a look at Karl Marx's actual program, and I did in the Communist Manifesto, I forget which edition it was had red and white and it was paperback. And I read it for Professor Livingston's Political Science 101 class in freshman year in SUNY Albany, State University of New York at Albany. And when I saw that breakdown where Marx talked about the despotic inroads on private property and the creation of industrial armies and use of child labor and the confiscation of the means of production, the confiscation of the property of immigrants and rebels, you know, so-called, which are very loose terms. You know, anybody who opposes Marx's utopia can be considered a rebel. So it's very loose terminology. I got to tell you, I was very turned off by that. I recognized that really Leninism is not a departure of Marxism, it's its logical conclusion of Marx as stated in the Communist Manifesto. And there were those on the left and heroes of this show, like Teddy Roosevelt, for example, that actually realize how dictatorial forms of socialism, Bolshevism, Marxism, as well as Mikhail Bakunin, not a particularly nice character in his attitudes on the Jews, for example, but they all recognize that Marxism, the logical conclusion of Marxism, is dictatorship. In fact, as Bakunin put it, scientific, ruthless aristocracy, as he put it, more or less. And this is what I soon realized, and that's why I never was attracted to Marxism. Now, on this show, we agree with the critiques of uncontrolled capitalism. We agree with Marx's view that the greed of the bourgeoisie serves as its own gravediggers. But where we separate ourselves is the solutions proposed by Marxism is against human nature. It is against the American psyche. And in order for it to be imposed realistically in the United States, there would be tremendous bloodshed that is completely needless. And it's based on an aggrandizement of complete and total power over individuals. It's an unhealthy variant of collectivism. It's unnatural and undesirable. And this is one of the reasons why I've inaugurated this project along with my co-host Herschel Miller, is to ultimately fight against these forces. So that is kind of my rehash on why I'm completely opposed to Marxism, or at least Marxist solutions. So let's fast forward. Now, you obviously were very close to the organized communist cells in academia. What got you interested in the Soviet Union? Was it a natural progression, like, hey, you know, these communists, they want to impose a Soviet-style government. Let's see what's going on in the Soviet Union. How did you become interested in Soviet politics?
Well, my main interest growing up was military history and strategy. And as I mentioned before, chess and Go, when I was like 10 or 11 years old, I think my favorite game was a game called um, Stratego.
Oh yeah, I remember that.
Capture the flag game, which just,
Mm-hmm.
I was just absolutely passionate about that game when I was 11. And so the idea of strategy and what it is really grabbed me at a very early age. And so that was very much my preoccupation as a child and a teenager. And so reading military history, reading about strategy, I remember how excited I was when I would go home from high school, and I would stop by this bookstore in a some kind of this store doesn't exist. It went out of business. I forget what it was called, and I think it was called Gemco or something like that. And they had a book section, and there I found Liddell Hart's, book strategy. And I threw my pennies together, and I got that, and I've read it more than once. And so I was very much into that, and so that colored me. And of course, I wasn't really interested in other subjects. I didn't like politics that much. And of course, the Soviet Union was a big part of recent military history in World War II. And so I, of course, had studied a lot about that by that time. But when I was in the 80s, when I had I'd started out as a journalism major and found out it was all politics, and I hated it. And then I said, well, I'm going to have to study political science, even though I didn't like the subject. And so I went there, and I had a British professor. He'd been a former British Marine, and he said, you need to be in political science. He basically recruited me to it. He said, you need to do this. You have analytical ability. And I found I had an aptitude for it, which I didn't realize that I had. So then you have somebody that kind of grew up with an interest in strategy and military history, who then went into studying sociology, and I got interested in psychology. Of course, I was a psychology minor as an undergraduate, and then ended up in graduate school in it. And it really was exciting for me. It was an interesting subject for me. And of course, I wanted, being a strategy, I would have loved to work as an analyst for the Pentagon or the CIA or something, to do work strategically, to use my analytical ability that way. But I quickly found that there was no place for someone like me there. In fact, when I applied for work at the CIA, they didn't contact me back. Now here I am with a very high GPA in the third most prestigious graduate program in the country for political science, and they didn't give me a call back after I filled out the form. And so I called them, and they said, "Oh, we're only looking for women and minorities. We're not hiring any white men right now."
And
They
this is
wouldn't even give me an
this is
interview.
when this is when
1987,
so this is under Reagan.
Yep, that's right,
Okay.
under Reagan. It was like I couldn't even get an interview to go to work for the CIA in 1987. They wouldn't give me one. So I don't know. Maybe, I don't know what that was about. Now, I knew other people who got hired from there, and they were the ones that were involved with the communist thing. Now, maybe somebody had said I was involved with communists when I was rubbing shoulders with them. I was watching them. They were looking at, but these other people got right in. They were feminists. They were very hard left. And it's like, this really alarmed me because I saw that people's careers, and I was basically told, you can make any career you want as long as you're with us, that they would take care of you. And I became convinced that they could. I became convinced because I talked to people who were just getting their PhDs, people who were conservatives at the time, and they said, I just wasted 4 years of my life, or however long it took them. I should never gotten this PhD. I'm not employable. They're not going to hire me. One guy told me how a black fellow graduate student who was very far to the left grabbed him and pinned him and threw him up against a wall during a seminar because he'd said something he didn't like. And it had shaken him up so bad. I mean, I thought, well, you dummy, you shouldn't have said that. But there are ways to handle those things. But the thing is, you got to know who you're sitting next to. But the problem is that it became clear to me they were so pervasive. Their degree of control was growing. Nobody was fighting them. And I realized that there was no future for me there. And there wasn't, of course. They prevented me from getting work in my own department eventually. And so I left. But I knew the whole country. And just think, that was 33 years ago that I left the program, almost, not quite, that I left the program I took a year off. And when I came back, they were going to be more nasty to me. So when I was going to come back in like 1990, I think it was, I just resigned from the program when they blocked me completely from all employment because I couldn't really afford after, 3 years of graduate school, you really can't afford it if you can't, getting an outside job is very difficult because it's a 50, 60 hour a week job just to get through graduate school. You don't really have time to take on other work and they give you teaching work that you maybe spend 10 hours a week, but it pays really well, better than anything an hour that you would do anywhere else.
Mhm.
And so I just had to leave.
Mm.
But I had already knew what I wanted to study and work on. And nobody by there that way, nobody was interested in that and nobody would have supported me in that work.
Mhm.
Anyway, I realized because I had gone through the defector literature in graduate school, I realized that nobody was paying attention or listened to what defectors from the former East Bloc had been saying, that there was a correlation, that there was actually very important things that they were saying that were just ignored. Particularly what Jan Shana and Anatoly Golitsyn and of course Zadislav Bittman had said. Those
Mhm.
three in particular, they both spoke of a faked future collapse of the Warsaw Pact alliance, that there was some kind of uh, NEP coming with a kind of fake collapse of the communist bloc. And they had different ways of describing it. It was just mentioned in passing by Shana and Bittman had alluded to it, but Golitsyn went into great detail, and he
Mhm.
came in for a massive grief for that. You had Cold Warrior, a book that was written by that
Tom
English
Mangold.
Tom
Tom
Mangold,
Mangold.
yeah, in which he basically slandered both former CIA counterintelligence chief James Angleton and Golitsyn, slandered them as both being mentally ill and
Mhm.
wrote oh so many lies. This caught my attention. And while this was going on, by the way, in 1988, my graduate department invited Georgy Arbatov, the head of the the Institute of Canada and USA Studies in the
Mhm.
Soviet Union. He'd been an advisor in his younger days of Stalin and
Mhm.
was, of course, an important advisor of Gorbachev. And he
Mhm.
was invited to UCI, to my school, to our political colloquium, the one we did we had
Did you
cheese and
drink
wine.
vodka with him? Did you
What's
drink
that?
vodka with him? Did you drink
No,
vodka
I
with him?
didn't. I didn't drink
Oh.
wine with him. No, but He came to our colloquium. They packed the room. Of course, they had all
Mhm.
of our professors were there. Rain Tagapera, particularly, he was from Soviet Estonia. He was public
Mhm.
enemy number two in Soviet Estonia. But these guys, they just fell over themselves for this guy. And this guy said, "Look, we have a new secret weapon. We're going to take away the image of your enemy." And he
Mhm.
said, to be a really good empire, you need a real evil empire, right? So you got Ronald Reagan said the evil empire. He says, "We're taking all that away from you. It's going to be a different game." And they were loving it. They were just loving it because he was telling them the Cold War was over and he was framing it as this was their trick. This was their, and of course it was. He was basically giving it away. And I had already by then known, I knew in 87, I'd figured it out from reading Golitsyn and Shana back to back. I figured out, I had the epiphany that year, they were going to collapse the Soviet Union. I knew it. I absolutely knew it in my mind. I said, I can't prove it, but I know they're going to do this. And whereas I'd read Golitsyn in 84 and I wasn't really that impressed, but I had
Mhm.
reread it after I'd read Shana and I said, oh my gosh, because now the difference was I knew the caliber of people who were working at CIA and State Department because I'd been rubbing shoulders with them for a couple of years, right? So I knew who they were, and I'll give you an example of the caliber of our intelligence analysts coming out of the university. When I was a fresh, wet behind the ears, in the graduate program, we were asked to go to a special um, lecture by a guy who was just getting his PhD. He'd been in the program for 4 or 5 years. He was going to work for Rand and he had prospects. He was probably going to work for the CIA or whatever as an
Mhm.
analyst. And I thought, oh, this is great. This is the guy that I want to do his job. I want to know. So I sit in there and this big, Dr. David Eastman, Easton, Dr. David Easton, who was very famous, he was one of the most famous American political scientists. He was the longtime head of the American Political Science Association, and he was actually singled out for criticism in the closing of the American Mind. Um, uh, um, Now I'm not remembering the guy that wrote that, but
Alan Bloom, I
Alan
believe
Bloom.
it, or
And in fact, I
Alan
was very
Bloom.
embarrassed because I was in a seminar with Dr. Easton, and I was carrying Bloom's book, and I actually got to the part about Easton while I was sitting next to Easton, and he was glaring at me, and I didn't realize he was glaring at me. And then I read the thing, and I looked over at him, and he's glaring at me, and I go, "Oh my God, he knows what's in this book, and I'm reading, and I'm such an idiot. I didn't know he was going to be named. He was going to be the villain of the book." But anyway, I was in this seminar with this older graduate student, and his expertise was the communist movement in Colombia, right? The different
Mm-hmm.
communist movements in Colombia. And he makes this blanket statement near the beginning of his lecture, and he says that none of the communist groups in Colombia have any connection to Cuba.
Was he
Uh,
snorting Colombian cocaine while saying that? I mean, is he?
no, well,
That's
this is
crazy.
early.
That
This
was
would
a
be,
joke. That was a bad
yeah,
joke.
this would be in the, I think this is in the fall of 1987. And and
Wow.
so he made the statement, and I was just amazed. How can you make a statement that all these communist groups, none of them have a connection with Cuba? I thought the right statement was, well, if there is a connection, we don't know of it. That you wouldn't categorically state there wasn't one, right? I mean, how would you know? How do you know what you don't know? And so what I did is I asked the question. I said, that doesn't really make any sense. You would expect that some of them would have contact. You absolutely know they don't. And then it was then that Easton grabbed me, tapped me on the back, took me out, and said, "Don't ask questions like that. You know, you're wet behind the ears. You don't know what you're doing. You have no right to ask that question." Sent me back in the room. So
Mm.
for years, I wondered, where this is kind of, I figured out where it comes from, but uh, I met a retired CI guy who worked in Colombia in the 80s
Mm-hmm.
and in the 90s. And I asked him, I said, I was in this seminar, in graduate school. And he said that none of the communist groups, guerrilla groups in Colombia had any connection with Cuba, he was saying. And he just got his, and he looked at me and says, "What year was that?" I says, 87. He says, "In 87, I was in Cuba. I wasn't in, uh, I actually wasn't in Colombia." And he said, my wife used to go to the queue to get the food, and she
Mm-hmm.
was in the same queue as the Colombian guerrillas in Cuba that were training there. So it's like, okay, that's what I thought. It's like, this is how dumb when you hear about the CIA or NSA or any group that has any kind of the DIA making analytical pronouncements. That's who those people are. They got
Well,
their PhDs, and that's who they are. They're people who they I want them in a poker game with their life savings. They're that stupid. I mean, they're very smart. This guy's smarter than me, I'm sure, but he doesn't have any common sense at all. None.
Well, I think part of it is the American psyche. We don't want to accept. We have this hubris, and it's expressed in popular media, popular movies, Top Gun, and others, where we're always the victors, and we don't like to admit that we can have our asses handed to us. And to give you an example of CIA activity in Latin America, I mean, let's take a look at Florentino Aspalaga, who was a major in the Cuban intelligence service, known then as the General Director of Intelligence, DGI. They turned all the CIA agents since the early 1960s into double agents that work for DGI.
That's right.
All of our sources. You take a look at all the intelligence services in Latin America that were aligned with communist states were trained by Cuba and the Soviet Union, East Germany. The East Germans turned, the Stasi turned all of the many of our CIA assets in the old GDR, East Germany, into again double agents. They were very effective. They
Yeah.
don't want. There are several things from my study. There are several things that work here. Number one, we don't want to admit that we can have our asses handed to us on the battlefield, whatever battlefield it could be. It's an American hubris thing, I think. Number two, as human beings, we don't want to accept bad news. We don't want to accept that we have global threats, literally that want to annihilate the independence and sovereignty of the United States. That's a very heavy thing to digest for most people. Thirdly, you also have, and this is kind of my little shtick on this show, is you have corporations, they want to do business with the USSR, with Russia, with China. They know full well that these governments are absolutely evil and want to bury the United States. And contrary to our conspiracy-oriented friends and the Illuminati and the bankers or whatever, I actually like to study things like corporate sociopathy. What do they actually do? What makes these people tick? Why are they so masochistic in their greed?
Here's your book right here. You get to get this book. Man, Nevin, your footnotes are fantastic. I mean, there's stuff like I wanna steal half your footnotes.
It's fine. You can steal all you want. You can steal the whole
You've
damn
got
thing.
such fantastic stuff in there. I mean, you've researched, you've gone into much greater detail. I mean, I I've I've known a lot of that detail and forgotten it. And I actually had, when I wrote Origins, I had a 1,000 pages. It was almost to my knee, more than that, of handwritten notes. And I thought, I can't use all of this because I can't even remember half of it anymore. But what I'd like to say about this whole thing about your Americans and strategy. Look, in my heart, I'm a strategist, and I taught myself from the time of 11 to think strategically. And it's not natural. It's like a language. Learning to think strategically, it's like learning a language. It doesn't come natural. Most people can't do it. The thought that enters your mind when you train yourself from an early age to think strategically is not what goes through most people's minds when they're confronted with these things. And this was the thing I found in American culture. We have a culture that's oriented towards money, towards the balance sheet, towards entertainment, and academically towards all these artificial prescriptions of what you do and you don't. A lot of it is quantitative social science. Not a very good methodology, in my opinion, although some of them are very clever, and I have to tip my hat to some of them. But that qualitative thinking, that strategic thinking, the wisdom, the deeper understanding is just absent, completely absent.
You're
The
saying from my
idea,
book,
yeah.
or just from my book, or
Well,
from
no, I mean from our academic community.
oh,
It's
from our
absent from
academic
our
community?
academics, the
Oh,
strategic
no
sense.
question, no
Right. I
question.
mean, you have good sense, very unusually for being somebody who's really studied a lot of library science. You have pretty good common sense in putting all these things together. When you look at these facts, you pretty much know what they mean. These people would not be able to do that. They would have some convoluted way of understanding it, and part of that came from the fact that, look, you have these. I mentioned David Easton, for example. They had these academic gods over them. These guys with these enormous reputations that could make and break people's careers, and you did not want to be on their bad side. And when they would tell you something, you pretty much had to do it. I mean, I probably would, if it. I have to thank David Easton because I wouldn't have studied Marx as hard or as diligently as I was forced to because of him. He made me study Marx in graduate school. He made me lecture on Marx before other graduate students. And so he was not going to let me get away with what a lot of conservatives do, is that they talk about Marxism and they don't know what they're talking about. They don't understand what it is.
Hmm.
And that's, you were talking about that earlier. And so this is there is such a huge learning curve on all of this stuff. And there's so many things the average American has no idea, both the kind of things our country's really confronted with, both in terms of our domestic situation and our foreign situation, in terms of the military and diplomacy and the political state of different countries and our own country. People don't understand how embedded Marxism is in our system, in the Pentagon, in the White House, in every department of government, and in our schools.
Hmm. I'll
Yeah.
give you an example. I mean, a little personal example, and I hope for the audience, of course, it's not inappropriate. My girlfriend, she's originally from Cuba, and at her workplace, she encountered people, including immigrants from Haiti, that were saying that Fidel Castro's Cuba was wonderful and that the healthcare is great there and it's a paradise and everything else. And of course, I've written papers about the healthcare in Cuba and the so-called education system and so-called healthcare in Cuba, and it's an absolute disaster. Even before the special period of prior to the early 1990s, it was a disaster, according to the actual defectors from the Cuban government's health service, including top officials there. Um, you look at that, so really and truly, and part of that is also media. Stretching as far back as the Barbara Walters interviews with Fidel Castro, uh, you have it in Ted Turner and CNN, you have, and even some journalists like Lionel Martin and, oh gosh, I forget the other guy, Robert Tabor. Those were journalists, I think, from like CBS or ABC that actually settled in Cuba and worked for the Cuban government. They were Cuban agents, essentially. So we have to take a look at also the media angle too. And our friend Cliff Kincaid and Reed Irvine, they did a very good job with accuracy in media reports. I used to read them in the basement of the college library. I told that to Cliff. Actually, I read your stuff while I was in college in the basement in the library for fun. And they do a good job covering that. So you have a media angle where, yes, it's very corporate friendly, but on the flip side, when it comes to foreign policy, they really ignore actually what's going on in various communist states and other sort of socialist and Islamist dystopias. So you have the media angle that really does not help either. And it's a huge problem. It really is. And she was shocked by this, and it was deeply upsetting. My girlfriend was really upset by this and everything else, and as she should be. I mean, listening to people growing up in communist countries, I find, I'm trying to put this in the right way, people are profoundly affected when they leave a communist country. It's almost like they need almost therapy to overcome it. There's a fear, there's paranoia, there's sometimes it makes you into a better person. Like my girlfriend, it made her a very strong person and taught her children to be, to survive and be self-sufficient. So you have a good end product on that. One of the many things I admire about her. But it's very humbling and very sobering when you actually meet people from those dystopian societies and how affected they are.
Well, one of the things I did is I forced myself to read as many prisoner memoirs from the communist bloc as I could, not just the Gulag Archipelago, but other prisoner memoirs. Memoirs of poets and journalists who've been thrown into jail. There was quite a few. In the 1980s, there were quite a few of those memoirs. Mm-hmm. And some of them, the tortures that those people underwent in prison were so horrifying that I would have to put the book down for a couple of days because I could not hardly bear it myself to read about that kind of abuse. And so I did develop, like anyone, who has studied the tortures of the Nazi regime, you develop a great hatred of this tyranny, that it has made so many innocent people suffer for it's like the sheer cruelty of it. It is a monstrous system. And there's lots of reasons for it. It's very complicated. But it is a monstrous system. And some of the wisest people in our lifetime have been people who came out of that prison system, whether it's Solzhenitsyn or Vladimir Bukovsky. There are people who've experienced it. I remember I interviewed Harry Wu, which was really an experience just to talk to him. He'd been in the Chinese Laogai for 19 years. He wrote Bitter Winds. And you talk about a horrific prison. The Chinese prison system makes the Russian prison system seem like a luxury vacation by comparison. And that guy, I have to tell you, of all the people I've ever met or talked to, he had this iron will. He had this iron strength that you could just feel it in him. He was not, there was no moral compromise with him. and I was awed, to be honest, uh, by what these people, because there was a kind of purification through suffering, and there was this wisdom that came from it, and the fact that Americans are so much into comfort and don't want to read that sort of thing, don't want to, we have lost so much by this weak and easy culture and this refusal to really look at hard facts and be honest with ourselves. There is a corruption, a downfall with us. And I'm afraid we're paying the price for that right now. And that price is going to get higher very quickly here.
Yeah, and we're going to be talking about that in a future episode on the military balance today, where the United States is headed, because that's extremely important. And one of the things I wanted to ask you, in my book, first volume of my books, Turning the Page, I talk about how there are American left leaders, communist leaders, who have violent tendencies, who are literally crazy, and not in a good way. Not like Nevin crazy, having fun and laughing and all the rest of it. This is like really bad crazy. We talk about people like Jim Jones. You talk about Bella Abzug, who said those Indo-Chinese anti-communists should be deported and they deserve what they get, knowing full well that they would be put in concentration camps or executed. These are truly malicious individuals who can wear. I mean, you look at Jim Jones. I mean, Jim Jones was a Stalinist since his youth. He was a communist. He cooperated with the Guyanese. He had ties with the Soviets. He even wanted to will the People's Temple's funds in Guyana to the Soviet Union, to list a couple of things. And there are many, many other examples here. You have Ronald Dellums and his staff knowingly lying about the so-called international airport in Cuban-controlled Grenada under Morris Bishop and the New Jewel movement. And he had reports doctored knowing that that base was a Soviet and Cuban military. How do we know that? From captured New Jewel movement records that were basically published by the American government. And big, thick volume, by the way. This is where we're at. What do you think, actually, from your experience interviewing defectors from the GRU, the KGB, China, Romania, what motivates the average communists who are true believers, as well as the torturers and the soldiers, as well as the leaders? What's going on here?
Well, that's a complicated question. There's an interesting book that was published a few years ago called Political Potterology. It was really reconstituted because the Polish secret police had confiscated the original book. It was reconstructed by memory from one of the only surviving Polish psychologists from a university in Poland, that they had, when the regime went communist, they were being given their orientation to the new system, and they noticed that the man who was giving them the orientation was a psychopath. They noticed he had traits, psychopathic traits, and they started comparing notes, and they all speculated, does this regime intentionally promote psychopaths? This was the question. So they ended up embarking on a 20-plus year study of the kind of people the regime promoted. This is the Polish communist regime. They came into power after 1945 and until the end of the Cold War, and that is where that book, Political Potterology, comes from. Now, you may disagree with some of the social science methodology in the book, but I think there is something to what is being said. If you read the biographies of, Robert Payne is a biographer of a lot of famous people. He did a biography of Hitler and Marx and Lenin and so on. His biography of Karl Marx is, I think, the best one, because he really focuses in on Marx's pathological behavior. That there was something not just immoral about Marx, there's something disturbed about him. He is a person, you would either say he was a malignant narcissist or a psychopath from his behaviors. He had a lot of markers. And then you have with Lenin, a somewhat different personality. Lenin grew up in a wonderful family. He had wonderful parents, wonderful siblings. What a great family. But he was kind of the bad boy. He was protected, but he had really problematic behaviors from a very early age. And they were very tolerant people. They were very loving people. And
Mm.
they overlooked some of these faults. But these faults became, well, he became a mass murderer. And Mao Zedong, almost certainly a psychopath
Hmm.
or a sociopath. How he got the way he was that way from a fairly early age. Um, and of course, this is, it is a, you could say that Marxism, Leninism, or communism is a system of and by and for the psychopaths, right? Or sociopaths, however you want to. The only difference between the two is how they got that way. But
Hmm.
and if we suspend our judgment on that, it's like whatever they are, that seems to be it. There are a number of abnormal personality types associated with it, but we know we're talking about something that's evil, something that is destructive of human life and human well-being, and it is you could say it's a criminal political syndrome, or you could say that the communist revolution or socialist revolution in general has this tendency to become a a criminal enterprise on the political level.
Well, they
Yes,
engage their front corporations. They deal in all kinds of criminal activities. You
yeah,
take a
of
look at East
course.
Germany. They were selling blood plasma that was forcibly taken from prisoners. Cuba did that with political prisoners. They transferred blood plasma from dead political prisoners to the Viet Cong. They sold it for hard currency. They tested. You had various Western European and Japanese pharmaceutical and chemical companies permitted by the East Germans to test their medicines on political prisoners and everything and gain hard currency from that. My take on communism and my study of communism, which, it's not as extensive as yours because you have the added experience of actually knowing personally high level government defectors. But my impression from an academic point of view, it's a cruel, madly exploitative, extremely hypocritical, and very, very clever political movement at the leadership. The leaders I find are, for the most part, it's a balance between a sense of strategy and absolutely psychopathic, where they
Yeah.
are not afraid to kill millions of their own people and not even blink an eye. Um, with the rank and file, I find you have particularly in this stage of struggle against the capitalist governments or fascist governments or authoritarian right wing regimes, the communist movement, mass movement, they tend to either it's a combination of very ruthless terrorists as well as extreme idealists who actually believed in the utopian promise of communism. Of course, what happens with the individuals who believe in the utopian promises of communism, they tend to be social democrats or for whatever mild socialists. Well, they turn into anti-communists. You look at what happened in Southeast Asia. You had various Viet Cong officials, even Truong Nhan Tang, who defected to the West and said that the communists betrayed every promise to the South Vietnamese people, for example. And he was in on the deceptions and the lies and the corruption of communism. You look at in Nicaragua under the Sandinistas, you had many of the so-called Contras. I don't like the term because there were various so-called Contra groups. I mean, most of them were not even necessarily somocistas, and a few of them were somocistas that were reformists, like Enrique Bermudez, and then you had others like Adolfo Colero and Eden Pastora and others that were left-wing anti-communists or left-wing and became anti-Sandinista. Same
Until
thing in
Pastora got kidnapped and taken to Cuba and straightened out.
yeah, yeah, that's right. There's some that have said that he was turned, yeah, that he was
He
turned around,
was.
yeah.
Indeed, he was.
And
Yeah.
yeah, that's what happens. Usually the idealists get put against the wall and shot or left to rot in prison, essentially.
Well, and that's the thing about this whole sociopathy, psychopathy thing, that you are dealing with abnormal personalities, and I think this is part of the complexity of the phenomenon, is that is that people are not very wary in how they regard these things. They treat communism like it's a system. They have this academic understanding of communist theory and stuff. Say, oh well, it's all very good in theory and stuff. Well, no, not really. I
Hmm.
mean, theoretically, it's a mess, and as it is, it's not honest. If you like, what I did is I studied Marx, and it was very clear to me when I studied Marx, before I even knew his biography in detail, is I realized that he was inventing an ideology that was a pretext for taking power. So his formula, however brilliant his formulations are, however correct some of his critiques of the capitalist system might be, it was demagogy. It was an excuse for using violence and taking power, because that's really what he really wanted to do, and that's what it really boils down to. And then when you read his, but you can never read these kind of things without reading the biographies of the people, because the
Exactly.
biography, the actual story of who they are as people, explains why they wrote what they did, why
Exactly.
they invented these ideas, because there are good human beings who are scholars, who are honest, who are trying to find out the truth and trying to formulate a genuine theory that explains something. But that's not what Marx was doing, and that was the only genuine part of the theory, by the way, of Marxism, whether it's Marx or Lenin or Stalin or Mao, is that part that has to do with the science of taking power. That's where Marxism Leninism is really a science. That's when they talk about how to do a revolution, how to take power, when to do this or that, then it is a science. I would agree. And they're very good at it.
They're too good. In fact, I refer to it as the theology of power. You talk about Georgy Arbatov, about taking away the image of the enemy. That's not like saying, hey, we love you, we want to get along with you, we're loosening up. No, this is about gaining hegemony, knowing your enemy, knowing the international bourgeoisie and all of its hang-ups and weaknesses and greed and the naivete and the bourgeois culture that we just want to shop and have fun, and as you say, and just kind of sweep the bad news under the rug and all the rest of it. They know this. I
Yeah.
mean, they have a difficult time feeding their people, average
Yeah, they
workers,
don't
but
care.
they
Yeah,
don't
they
care
don't
about
care.
that.
Well, I'll tell you two. I'll tell you what two people from that world told me about the leadership. Harry Wu, when I interviewed him, I asked him, I said, how would you characterize the leaders of the People's Republic of China? He said, murderers. That was his, that was his kind. They're murderers. And well, should we have trade relations with them? They're murderers. Would you go into business with a murderer? He had a tremendous clarity. Then Colonel Stanislav Lunev, a GRU defector who had been one of Gorbachev's military briefers at one time, had been the deputy head of the GRU in the United States at the time of his defection. And Lunev, I asked him very stupidly, I said, well, are there any good people in the Kremlin or the general staff of the Russian Federation? And he looked at me, like I just said something very stupid. And he said, these are not human beings, these are crazy persons. And then he explained how the leaders of that system, you couldn't reach a certain rank unless you were psychologically abnormal, unless you were a psychopath or a sociopath. And so it isn't just simply some psychologist in Poland. I mean, people at different levels, whether it's a Gulag prisoner or a military briefer for Gorbachev, they've observed it at first hand. They know the system is run by criminal types, by sociopaths, by psychologically abnormal, evil people. And the fact that the West has collaborated, has helped, has gone into business with, has given support to these people. You want to know why we're in trouble? We're in trouble because you are an accessory after the fact. You got a mass murderer like Mao and you're Richard Nixon and you go over there and you shake his hand and you're going to make a deal with the biggest mass murderer in human history. You're going to sit opposite him and you're going to give him legitimacy. You're going to recognize his country. Richard Nixon, shame on you. Richard Nixon did something horribly evil. And it's not something that I can even comprehend. I can't believe he did it. And I can't believe that the conservative right in this country went along with it. But Buckley, from all the other ones all the way down, nobody attacked Richard Nixon for that. Nobody
Yeah, no,
attacked him.
the
Well,
made
well,
it
very
was
few did.
actually there were a few that did. There were some conservatives in the Senate. I forget the names that were very
Yeah,
critical.
you forget because they didn't get anywhere after that.
They didn't
They were
get
not.
anywhere.
They weren't paid attention to anymore.
You had a Republican politician, Barnes. I think he was in the California State Assembly. He actually resigned the Republican Party, and he represented Nixon's district in California, and he resigned. There was his original letter was on the internet at one time, and I quoted in one of my books. There were those that oppose it. Now, a guy that I really wasn't crazy about, because he really wasn't crazy about Jews and stuff like that. Um, John Schmitz, a congressman, and he was known to be kind of funny. So he said, I had no problem with Nixon going to China. I just had a problem with him coming back to the United States. And of course, I read the book. I loved it. I loved it.
Yeah,
It's
it's
terrific.
great. It is great.
It's
Well,
terrific.
yeah, and
So there are some good conservatives, but they become extinct because, and we're going to talk about this in a future show.
yeah,
Jeff has had experience with this. I've had a little bit of experience too. We can discuss it. The conservative movement, and you see, on this show, Herschel and I are former conservatives, Reaganite conservatives.
hmm
There is nothing wrong, and and then I'm gonna have to close. We'll have to close after this and have another part two of this interview. The Reaganism, when you look at Reaganism and when you really take an honest look at the conservative movement, and what turned me around was their collaboration with communists in China, with supporting trade with China, with in the Heritage Foundation firing people like Richard Fisher and Stephen Yates, I believe, for sounding the alarm on China, and Elaine Chao and Mitch McConnell and all AIG, Hank Greenberg, and others had these people fired. What conservative from the Heritage Foundation from warning against the Chinese
yeah.
military
The
build?
Heritage Foundation is awful.
It is awful on a lot of issues and good on some others. And the problem is Reagan-style neoliberal market fundamentalists. What they really want to conserve is the political power and the private wealth of private sector oligarchs, and that is a major bone of contention. And I could never understand why people like Ron Johnson, as a businessman, did business with China, and all these professional anti-socialists. And really, I'm sorry, when it comes down to it, they only oppose socialism when their class interests and profits are impaired by, quote, social democratic policies. But yet, if the profits are enhanced, well, China's a capitalist country, and we can do business, and their labor force is very disciplined and whatnot. And they'll say that the United States is more communist than China or Russia. And
Well, these
that
people are morally challenged, basically, and
they are.
like the best part of your book here. This is volume one of your Turning the Page. The best part of this book is your part about Reagan administration. Like everybody thinks Reagan won the Cold War. Reagan was great against communism. No, he wasn't. I mean, you've got the facts there. I was alive then. I was watching, and I was very I would be a person who would side with Senator Malcolm Wallop on
Mm-hmm.
saying the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty was a tragedy and it was a travesty. And all of these kind of agreements that Reagan ended up going with the Russians and saying Gorbachev is a man we can do business with, these are things that should have never happened. And this was the beginning of the victory that was won by the communists at the end of the Cold War, where they basically convinced us that we had beaten them and we'd done nothing but hand everything over to them. And it's one of the fundamental misunderstandings. You go to Fox News, you listen to that idiot Hannity, and I'm sorry, I have nothing but contempt for him. He says all the time Reagan won the Cold War. Somebody should stuff a wet sock in his mouth and shut him up, because that is damaging, because it's not true. And you so-called conservative, you're going to say what's not true. You're just a liar. You're just another kind of dupe. You're just another useful idiot. You just say you're on the right. You just say you're anti-communist. No, you're not. These people are not anti-communist. They're nothing. And they've just fooled everybody. And that's the problem I have with them all.
There's a lot of things, I think the three of us, Herschel, my co-hosts, and myself, and you, there are a lot of laudable goals in conservatism as is traditionally understood. Solid nuclear families, expansion of the birth rate, entrepreneurialism on a local level, strong national security. All three of us agree with that. The problem is the conservatives in this country have smashed all that into pieces because of their economic policies that they've imposed, as well against the popular will, and also having a wholly contradictory policies towards national security. Reagan is a perfect example. Reagan did some very good things with the liberation of Grenada, with a coalition of Caribbean nations. There are times where the Democrats sabotaged, the left wing of the Democratic Party sabotaged Reagan's attempts to get meaningful aid to the FDN and other anti-Sandinista resistance forces. But when you take a look at the other side of the equation, Reagan lifted the grain embargo on the Soviet Union, which, as we later learned, a lot of that grain was transferred, according to Richard Starr and other experts, to the Soviet military and the KGB in stockpiles. Reactors were transferred to Ceausescu's Romania. Arms were shipped to Yugoslavia. And there was a full split that existed between Romania and the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union. And that volume you just held up, I summarized in detail how the splits were vastly exaggerated. He built up China, put what Nixon and Ford did and even Carter did on steroids. It was under Reagan where we first started to get trade deficits with the People's Republic of China. Even the embargoes against Gaddafi's Libya and Sandinista Nicaragua had more holes, more loopholes than the Swiss cheese that I have in my refrigerator. I mean, and the problem is that, and this is where I think you and I and Herschel agree, it's not some grand conspiracy theory of Illuminati or bankers. These are complex political forces and competing power centers within the Republican Party, and they exist within the Democratic Party too as well, competing against each other and overpowering each other. And it's, and
Look,
really,
people are tempted. People are tempted. They see the chance to make use of cheap Chinese labor or cheap Russian natural resources, and so they're willing to sign up for it because they see that they can make some money. Well, the thing is that man doesn't live by bread alone, and it shouldn't be when you're dealing with enemies all about making money. And we have not had a national security state that could make the big money capitalist people stick to a patriotic actions. Instead, they've used their money to weaken the state, to be able to do what they want, and to break down the actual defenses of the West in order to make the economic deals that they want to make. And that's what you could boil down the whole problem to that. People wanting to make money, money wanting to go where it wants, and not wanting to abide by the fact that these countries here are our enemies, and trading with them isn't going to change them. And China, you might say that they have some capitalism there, but the fact is it's the state capitalism of the Chinese or the Russian regime is capitalism that's under the guidance of the communist parties of those countries. And believe it or not, if anybody wants to believe that Russia doesn't have a underground communist party running everything from behind the scenes with the same nomenclature as before, well, then your head's on backwards because you haven't been paying attention.
Well, just take a look at the reports of the report written by Yevgeny Novikov, who was a Gorbachev-era defector for the International Department of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. He talks about a report, I think, for the Jamestown Foundation, the communists controlled the privatization process. I quote that in my book. You look at your Financial Sense columns where you quote various sources within Russia and Ukraine. You take a look at what Yeltsin said in 1990, that quote that I sent you a while ago, where he said that we're still going to have a socialist economy. It's just we're not going to say we're going to have a socialist economy, meaning the state owning everything that is nailed down and isn't nailed down. And you got to people got to pay attention to what they're saying. Our friend Jimmy from Brooklyn says you can get a lot of good material if you know how to read communist literature and communist speeches. You just have to be able to translate it. And strategically, they're brilliant. And I'm very fearful of them. And I'll have you do your closing statement for this episode, but we're going to have you back for multiple episodes for this because it's basically a debriefing conversation. But to the people out there who are our base of support for our show, the workers, the rank and file union supporters, the patriotic progressives, and yes, they do exist, social democrats, dissident conservatives, populists out there. I have to say, based on what Herschel and I have talked about in our shows before, my solo podcasts on odds and ends that I do, what Jeff has said, you cannot collaborate with communists, actual communists. They're very dangerous. Once you enter into United Front, you're going to learn sooner or later that these individuals at the leadership level are after power. They will consort with foreign enemies that want to smash worker rights. They want to smash independent unions and everything else. And they have no problem in collaborating with the worst capitalist exploiters, which, of course, leads you to believe that it's all about power and expanding power. So all it is, these people are not your friends. And for those of you who are communists out there, I encourage you to read my book. I don't take the neoliberal conservative, line. Jeff, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm there. My camera went out for some reason.
Oh, okay. Well,
sorry.
So, the point is you can't collaborate with these individuals. I mean, I encourage the communists out there to take a look at my book. I don't take the sort of neoliberal market fundamentalist views. I even have some social democratic policies mixed in with a very heavy helping of capitalism. And I have to make it clear. We have, Herschel and I, as Herschel mentioned on the Herschel Miller Show, which is a spin-off of this broadcast, we have no problem with people making money. I could care less. People in my family make tons of money, shitloads of money. They're good to their workers. They're good to their communities. And as long as you're good to your workers and you don't violate the national security of this country or don't do what Paul Singer did in Sidney, Nebraska, and just because he wanted to make more money, he wiped out a town and closed multiple call centers, wiping out the tax base. That kind of capitalism we don't support. That kind of capitalism drives people to neo-Nazis. It drives people to communism. I talk about it in volume 2 in my book. From Joe Sims of the CPUSA, who said that he was almost going to leave communism when the Berlin Wall was falling, but then came NAFTA, then came financial deregulation. He saw that the capitalists, the big corporations, not all of them, but many of them, were fulfilling the caricature painted to them by the communists. Or you take a look at the former head of the Traditionalist Workers' Party, a neo-Nazi group. What's his name? Oh gosh, I forget. He's on Light Upon Light, which is a collection of repentant Islamic terrorists and neo-Nazi leaders. And this found one of the founders of the neo-Nazi Traditionalist Workers' Party. Why did they join neo-Nazi movements, all these people? Because of disinvestment in Appalachia, free trade, financialization of the economy, and everything else. Karl Marx, in a way, predicted this with his speech on free trade. He predicted this about the bourgeoisie. We don't want to wipe out the bourgeoisie. We don't want to do what the Nazis did with the bourgeoisie, which basically turned them into cogs of the state. We're not interested in that. We are, when necessary, they have to be subordinated to the state in order to survive. They need a protector, as you pointed out in your book, and from their self-destructive tendencies and whatnot. And that means we have to repurpose our system. And of course, we can have that discussion in a future show. Will that repurposing come in time? No. It's going to take a catastrophe to wake up people. And there's no guarantee that people like you and I are going to be in the conversation either. There's no guarantee. My co-host Herschel said, as much as we cannot stand the libertarians and the Reaganites, if you had no choice, between fighting on behalf or fighting with one group versus the communists. He said, Nevin, who would you pick? And I thought about it for a second because I really don't like both movements for ruining the country. And I said I'd fight the communists because we will need every man. I would join with the libertarians and the Reaganites only for one reason, because the communists will have superior firepower. They all have Russia and China and their allies, and we will need every man in the field to fight them. It's
Yeah.
and
I think that what people are going to think in the future is going to be something different that we don't even realize. Consciousness, our very consciousness, is going to be changed by the events that are coming toward us now. Just to give a little blurb from my website, jrnyquist.blog, jrnyquist.blog. There's a lot of essays there. Please go there and read and subscribe. But yeah, I think that to talk about present day ideologies as something that have any kind of future, no. I don't think any of our ways of talking about politics now are going to survive the end of the present dispensation. The way we talk about politics now is a product of a dispensation that's going away. When it goes away, we'll see how people talk. We'll see how they feel then.
exactly, because we don't know what's going to happen. And even what is talked about in your latest essay, the interview with, oh gosh, I forget, he was like a sort of, I don't want to say psychic to be crude about it, but
Leo Degard, he's a writer in Germany who was looking at seers, supernatural people who had special abilities. He looked at them, I think, going back 400 years, and he found that there were some similarities between what they were saying about the future, about the time that we're living in now. It's kind of intriguing, and he did a book. I helped him a little bit by helping him with a chapter of it 20 years ago, and occasionally go back and ask him, are these things coming true? Are these prophecies being fulfilled? And there is something about I used to, when I was at university, I used to have lunch with a parapsychologist, and we should get into that a bit. And there is reality there. There's a supernatural element to reality, whatever you want to call it. And I've heard stories. I've seen some of the experimental data. So there's that whole thing. And we probably should also talk a little about UFOs, because they're massively in the news right now, and there's a huge
they are.
intelligence and military dimension to that, a political dimension, which is also interesting. So,
Yeah, absolutely. We should discuss that in a future episode. The other thing I wanted to, mention, and Degard pointed out how society will actually, I don't want to say revert, because it's not necessarily a negative thing in my eyes, to certain traditional community-based values. Technology will actually improve over time after a little bit of a hiatus, and families will become tighter and whatnot. So maybe something good will come out of this after a catastrophe. And I believe that I do, as an optimist. I mean, I'm generally an optimist in my everyday life. That's how I am. I put my political hat in the box, and I generally am the type of person. I like most people, and I'm very positive when warranted. And I think in the long term, I think we'll get through this okay, but it's going to take tremendous losses to get from point A to point B. Jeff, did you have anything to say to close this segment?
well, thank you. And yeah, buy my latest book, The Fool and His Enemy. It's on Amazon. J.R. Nyquist. I usually publish under that name, and look forward to doing this again, Nevin. Thank you.
And before, by the way, before you read that book, I definitely recommend Origins of the Fourth World War. That is a brilliant book that deploys sociology, political science, economics, and national security strategy in a relatively small paperback book. So that, if you want to start with that, go to Amazon.com, bookfinder.com, and read Origins of the Fourth World War, and also read Jeff's other books. And also please go to his website, jarednyquist.blog, and his articles on WorldNet Daily, and I think Newsmax are still archived, so check those out too as well. Thank you so much, Jeff, for appearing on the show, and we're going to have you several more times.
All right. Thank you very much.
All righty.